Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and president of Hannon News Service here in Columbus. It's great to see you today. We are live streamed today thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, the Columbus Dispatch, and WBNS 10 TV and PNC. We'd also like to thank those of you who purchased a virtual seat for today's forum. We are very grateful for this support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you. Thank you. Welcome to today's forum, the Statehouse Rocked by Corruption. It is a sad day when stories of greed and corruption on the steps of the Ohio Statehouse lead the news. More will come from this story. There will be ramifications on many levels, but ultimately, we are only as good as the people we elect. So what's next? Let's welcome our experts, Republican strategist, founder of Communications Council, Mark Weaver, journalist and story breaking the day it happened at the Dayton Daily News, Laura Bischoff, Democratic strategist and president and CEO of New Visions Group, Derrick, and our host, news programming director at WOSU Public Media, Mike Thompson. Mike, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching online. I think we can objectively say that what became House Bill 6 did not have the smell of pure legislation altruistically crafted to benefit all Ohioans. I think we all knew this as this was going forward. This is the law, for folks who haven't been paying attention closely, that bailed out 2 nuclear power plants and 2 coal plants, one of which is in Indiana. We in Ohio are good neighbors, after all. The campaign to get the bill passed in the legislature was extraordinary. Millions and millions of dollars spent on lobbying and television ads to convince lawmakers to change the law. It started from a clean energy bill to a straight-up bailout of the nuclear plants and the coal plants. It drew support from Republicans, who normally hate corporate bailouts. It drew support from Democrats, who normally hate big corporations and coal emissions. Money came from every corner of big energy, not just nuclear power, but also natural gas and oil. That money was to oppose it and to support it, and it became law, but just barely. Then the campaign strategists who saw that campaign before the legislators said, hold my beer. The repeal campaign was even more extraordinary. It featured ads claiming a Chinese takeover, scuffles between petition gatherers and so-called petition watchers. There was reports of people offering petition gatherers hundreds of dollars to basically leave town. Again, millions and millions of dollars spent for and against the repeal from all sectors of Ohio's energy industry. So Laura Bischoff, you broke this story. On a scale of 1 to 10, how surprised were you when this indictment came down about HB 6 and it was called one of the largest, if not the largest, bribery scandal in Ohio political history? How surprised were you, 1 to 10?
Well, as you just, 8.5. I mean, you
8.5, you were surprised or were not surprised?
Oh, I was not surprised.
Okay.
I mean, the fact that you just laid it out, that this was a campaign and a lead up to this in which there was extraordinary amounts of money pushed into it. Not only were there strange bedfellows on the front end of it, but on the referendum campaign, it was the free market people who didn't like it, the environmental groups, and the oil and gas people. So that was like a strange coalition on the referendum side. It just seemed as though there was so much pressure and so much attention paid to this. What was surprising was the number, almost $61 million. That was staggering to me. You know, I knew that there was at least on the referendum campaign, the last I was able to count was like maybe $18 million spent just on TV advertising. So I knew it was a big number, but I was also surprised to see the feds try to tie in dark money as the vehicle for the bribe payments. This is the first time in the Southern District that they're using a racketeering charge in a public corruption case, and I'm told that this is the first time in which the underpinning of that case, of a public corruption case, has to do with dark money.
In a nutshell, dark money has been criticized as Citizens United. companies, donors don't have to disclose their donations, the groups don't have to disclose their contributions. What brought it from just tough politics to a crime?
Well,
Alleged crime.
Alleged crime. Yeah, the other thing is, we should all point out that the government has indicted these 5 men and Generation Now, and that's an accusation that the government has to prove in a court of law. Everybody has the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. What they're alleging is that there was all this money applied to Householder, his candidates, to get them into legislative seats so that he could defeat Ryan Smith and then be positioned to take over as Speaker of the House. And once he was Speaker, he moved pretty quickly to craft and introduce House Bill 6. I remember sitting in the press conference in early April when it was first rolled out by him. He assigned it to a couple of lawmakers who were on his team, Jamie Callender and Shane Wilkin, and appointed a subcommittee on energy generation. He moved very quickly, and they put so much money into pressuring for the votes, and then also the real money came, like 38 million of the 61 million came allegedly on the referendum side.
Derrick, you were working, some of your clients were opposed to HB 6. Originally, they liked parts of it. Correct me if I'm wrong. They liked some of the clean energy parts. But generally, you were working against HB 6. Mm-hmm. Looking back at that campaign, did you suspect there was more than just hardball, even perhaps dirty politics taking place there?
Well, as Laura mentioned, the amount of money that was being thrown around was staggering. So we had always questioned where's all this money coming from. But yes, we did work on the opposite side of HB 6. We had several meetings with various different legislators on that bill, and there were times where we were questioning why we would ask for certain amendments, and those amendments may or may not be in the bill, and that's not unusual for a legislator to say we'll consider your amendments. But amendments that were said that they were going to be in the bill did not appear in the bill. We started, wondering why that was.
Mark Weaver, you're a former prosecutor. What are your impressions of this case? I'm sure you've read the indictment, or at least know quite a bit about it. What are your impressions of this case? Is it a strong case?
Well, I did. I read all the charges carefully, and I have prosecuted public corruption cases as recently as last fall in Williams County. And what strikes me is that there is a mix in these charges. First of all, let me say David DeVillers is an outstanding prosecutor. I supported him to get the appointment for that job. And if you don't know David DeVillers, you should. He's just an outstanding person to bring these charges, incorruptible. But as I read these charges, they are a mixture of criminal allegations and criticisms of the political system, the former being punishable by prison and fines, the latter not. And the person the FBI agent who laid out the affidavit that first brought this charge, interestingly worked in the Michigan legislature and so understood the system a little bit. And so woven throughout those charges, which is a long read, the day it came out, there were a lot of people around Cap Square who were pouring through this, trying to, put together who's company A and who's person B and who's, state rep 3, whatever. What struck me is there's a lot of criticisms of how politics is done, but none of that is part of what must be proved by the prosecutor. Prosecutors have elements to crimes that they have to prove, and the notion that dark money is something some people don't like is not part of the elements of the crime.
You mentioned some of the euphemisms that are in the indictment. Yeah. Company A has been determined that was First Energy, the power company based in Akron. To have a bribe, someone has to accept the bribe, someone has to give the bribe. Why are there no executives from First Energy, the major funder behind this, why are they not listed in the indictment as being charged?
Yeah, so before I moved to Ohio, I worked at the Department of Justice, at Main Justice in Washington. One thing we know about federal prosecutors is that they move slowly, and they often overcharge in the hopes of getting people to plead to lesser crimes and then testify against other people. I would be shocked if there is not another wave of charges that come from this. I have zero inside information, so this is not Mark giving you a scoop. Just watching it from afar, as somebody who has prosecuted public corruption cases, I would imagine we will see other charges.
With that, again, we're just speculating with the way these things play out. Some of the 5 folks who've been charged here might strike a deal and cooperate and perhaps implicate others. Is
What
that
a
possible
shock it
scenario?
would be if deal
Okay.
makers try to strike a deal. Could you imagine that? It's hard to imagine that happening.
Laura, you did break this story. What are you hearing? I don't want to reveal your sources or methods, but are there more charges to come if you gathered that?
Just on speculation, I agree with Mark. I think that they do the shock and awe, and they have what had been a covert operation go public. And, I think Dave DeVillers said at the press conference, we're looking for anybody who's got information, come forward, come forward, come forward. And I'm sure that, they have people knocking on their door. And so we'll see. Obviously, you're correct. Somebody has to pay the bribe. Somebody has to receive the bribe. There's, two dance partners there.
Let's get to the bigger issue, what is behind all this, and that's the whole system that is set up that was made legal, made constitutional by the Citizens United decision that allows nonprofit groups that do social service to collect money, don't have to disclose who's giving, how much they're giving. And Derrick, this was at the foundation of this. There were at least 2 of these groups involved in this, a couple more perhaps. Is this the poster child for what could go wrong with the Citizens United system that the Supreme Court endorsed or upheld?
I think it's absolutely the poster child for that. That was the fear of the premise behind, the Supreme Court case is that, you would have these entities that would be able to donate money to a nonprofit. They wouldn't have to disclose their donors, but they could use it for, political purposes. So it is absolutely the poster child in the biggest way.
Mark, should we get rid of these groups?
Well, it's hard to, because this is First Amendment protected. I used to teach election law at Akron, and so in my class, we would talk about Citizens United. And blaming Citizens United for this, I think, is wrong-headed. The New York Times, it's now been proven that the sort of their collusion story about Russia has fallen completely apart. Yet I don't blame the First Amendment and their right to print what they printed. I think they had a right to print all that. I think it was substantively wrong, but I wouldn't go after their ability to print that stuff. And so what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United was, if a few of us get together and want to form a group to communicate, we ought to have the right to do that under the First Amendment. And a lot of donors are looking at what's happening in America right now with the doxing or the releasing of personal information and then targeting people for shame. And so that's why some donors don't want to give. Now, others may have much less noble notions for wanting to keep their money and their name private. But when we saw what happened to Amy Acton, for example, where her personal home was targeted by protesters, that's just wrong. The notion that I disagree with you, therefore I'm going to personally vilify you and show up at your house where your family or your children are, is so many donors see that as part of 2020 current affairs, and so many of them want to avoid that. And I know not everybody has that reason.
But the problem comes in not just that somebody gives $500 to a candidate or a cause they believe in. It's somebody gives $61 million or $35 million. Let's be conservative. And we don't know that's happening. Is there a middle ground where we could say, okay, I'll protect your identity to express your First Amendment rights, but you can't have that much influence?
Well, not constitutionally, no. I mean, it's not just Citizens United. There was a case out of Ohio called Mcintyre versus the Ohio Elections Commission. This is the 7-2 Supreme Court case that said it's legal to keep yourself anonymous when spending politically, based on an Ohio, a woman out of Westerville, Mrs. Mcintyre. And so I used to teach the case. This morning I looked at it again, and I've forgotten about this quote. This is not a close call, 7-2. Supreme Court on anonymous speech, quote, "It's not a pernicious, fraudulent practice, but an honorable tradition of advocacy and of dissent." And they pointed to the Federalist Papers that were written anonymously to avoid scrutiny of the authors and focus on the ideas. So this notion of anonymous speech is one that's well protected by Supreme Court precedent.
Laura, there are efforts at the Statehouse to try to make it more transparent. Is that just lip service, or are they serious efforts?
You know, it's interesting. I do think that the conditions are probably better now for reform than they were 6 months ago. So there's a couple of different bills pending. One is House Bill 737, which is sponsored by Gail Manning, a Republican from North Royalton, and Jessica Miranda, Democrat from Cleveland. And it's got the support of the Ohio Secretary of State, Frank LaRose. And it would require, if you're going to have a 501c4 that's spending in Ohio on political matters, then it would require reporting through the state. You know, Louis Brandeis said that the best disinfectant is sunshine. And so this kind of works on that premise that transparency and disclosure will help clean it up.
Derrick, it comes down to the Supreme Court, and the courts have said money equals speech. How much money? Should it be unlimited amounts of money? We have unlimited amounts of free speech. We could stand on the street corner 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and as long as we don't yell fire in a crowded theater, we can do all we want. But should that same apply to the amount of money someone could give to a campaign or to a political cause?
Well, you know, if you have the money to give it, I mean, that's your discretion whether you want to give that money to a C4. You know, right now we're under the law from that Citizens United case where people can give unlimited amounts of money to a C4 or C4 nonprofit. So until that court case is overturned or challenged, then that's the law of the land that we all have to abide by, unfortunately.
Is it too much money? Slosh it around at the Statehouse? You guys have both advocated for groups and helped raise money and spent money that's been raised. I mean, you're part of the system. Laura covers the system.
It's a lot of money, no doubt, but when you look at what America spends on Halloween candy and costumes every year, it pales in comparison. There's lots of money done for lots of things. Halloween candy and costumes don't have the protection of the First Amendment. Remember, the Supreme Court's been very clear, the speech that aggravates us the most gets the most protection. And when you're laying out what speech is protected, political speech is the highest protected speech. And so whatever laws get passed, and I'm interested to read the details of the ones that are being put out there, they will have to withstand First Amendment scrutiny, just like the news organizations represented today. If someone didn't like a story they wrote and wanted to pass a law about it, it'd have to get past First Amendment scrutiny first.
Yeah, but what I'll add is that as long as you have cases like Citizens United, there will always be the potential for corruption, because you're dealing with money that you can't identify the donors. The money can't be, therefore the money can't be scrutinized. And just think, if this FBI informant didn't come forward, they could have potentially gotten away with this.
Laura, it's tremendously hard journalists, we go over the Federal Election Commission reports, the Secretary of State reports, the local Board of Election reports to see who's giving, how much they're giving. But it's hard to search all those, and then you have these other groups that are doing political activity, even though they say they're not, they're social service, and they're totally in the dark, undisclosed.
Right, so that's one of the limitations, is that there is no disclosure on this 501c4 money. And let's keep in mind that there was Generation Now, there was Hardworking Ohioans, there was this Energy Pass-Through Group, there was, what's the AEP one, Empowering Ohio's Economy.
Who comes up with these names?
It's a random generator.
It's a random generator.
Toss in a noun, a verb, and an adjective, and then it spits out the name.
It's the dark
That's
money
a joke. I don't think
generator.
that's really true.
So anyway, you know, we can look at the filings through the Secretary of State's office or the FEC, but we're missing a lot of the money that's going into these debates, and so it makes it difficult. Really, with this dark money, the only people who have a flashlight are the ones who have subpoena power, and that's the FBI in this case.
Mark, I'm guessing, getting back to the case and the whole how the system works, if I'm a defense attorney for these defendants, I'm saying, you know what? This is the system. We were operating in it. Yeah, we were tough. We were playing hardball. We offered to buy a plane ticket and give a couple $1,000s to a person on a street corner with a clipboard. But what we did was hardball, perhaps dirty, maybe even slightly unethical, but it wasn't illegal.
Well, first of all, I'll be surprised if all these charges go to trial. I think there'll be a lot of plea bargains, and I think there'll be a lot of deals cut, and then maybe one or two goes to trial. At that trial, though, we'll say this, federal prosecutors have many more powers and many more statutes available to them, and frankly, greater resources than state prosecutors do. And as a result, that's why they can sort of force people into plea bargains, because the resources are so strong. Having said that, you only need one person on the jury to say, I don't see a crime, and the jury hangs, because you have to have a unanimous verdict in order to acquit or to convict. And so every prosecutor has to worry about that, because if you have a hung jury on a big case, then you have to make a very tough decision about whether you bring the case again, which can be expensive and take a long time. So I would be surprised if many of these cases make it to trial. And I will say this, remember, the first paragraph or so of that complaint or the affidavit from the FBI agent said, I'm not saying everything I know, which was interesting because it went on for 81 pages.
I caught that.
Yeah, wasn't that fun? So I will say this, having only read 81 pages of other things, I didn't see the connecting of the dots on bribery that I would want as a prosecutor in order to make my case beyond a reasonable doubt. So I imagine they have other evidence, or they're going to need other evidence to make people, because it's one thing to say, isn't it terrible what they did, tut, tut. It's another thing to prove every element of every crime beyond a reasonable doubt.
Laura, there are a couple items in there that are clearly, if proven true, are clearly illegal involving Larry Householder.
Sure, they said that, that $300,000 in generation money, wiggled its way through to pay off legal fees and a settlement in a lawsuit in which he was personally held responsible. $101,825 associated for cost to his condo in Florida. $97,000 to pay some of his householder representative campaign expenses, and another $20,000 to pay off credit card debt. That all sound, that falls under what the affidavit says is personal use.
You can't use campaign funds, any political donations, for personal use, just to wine and dine voters, if you want, or to run a campaign or buy ads and things like that. I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10 how surprised you were that this came to a case. You've covered Larry Householder for a long time. How surprised were you that he was involved in this?
What's surprising to me is that, Larry Householder was a speaker in 2001 to 2004, and he left due to term limits, but at the time, the FBI had an open investigation into allegations of pay-to-play, and they closed it in 2006 with no charges. I was talking to Mike Curtin the other day, former publisher of the Dispatch, and he said, Speaker Householder tiptoed past the grave once before. You'd think he would have been more careful. On top of that, he replaced a guy who left because, he voluntarily resigned, Cliff Rosenberger, while under investigation by the FBI. I'm told by the FBI that investigation is ongoing, but it's been more than 2 years, and we haven't heard boo about what's going on with that one.
Derrick, one of the reasons why Householder became, perhaps the only reason, go ahead.
I'll also add, since his attorney's in the front row here, that Cliff Rosenberger has not been charged with anything, and he denies all wrongdoing, and says that he has acted in ethical and lawful manner throughout his term in office.
Derrick, the reason why Larry Householder became Speaker is he got as many votes from Democrats in the House as he did from Republicans.
Right.
What level of responsibility do Democrats have for putting him in this position where he allegedly did all these wrong things?
Well, in terms of responsibility with the criminal complaint, there's zero responsibility. But in terms of, responsibility of him being Speaker, yes, the Democrats did vote to put Larry Householder in the speakership. But they were choosing between the less of two evils. The Republicans have a supermajority in the House. The Democrats didn't have any power. Ryan Smith, who was the Speaker at the time, did not want to work with them. So Larry Householder wanted to work with them, and they, as a result of that, they got cameras in every one of the committee rooms. They were able to hire a human resources person full-time. They were able to negotiate some shared responsibility on some committees. So the Democrats did what was in their best interest at the time. Did they know that Larry Householder was masterminding this criminal enterprise? No.
But they knew his history and his checkered past.
They knew
as a former Speaker and also as the Perry County Auditor, where he had some ethics issues as well.
Yeah, they knew it. absolutely. But he had not been charged by the FBI at that time. The Democrats were looking to gain some power in the House of Representatives, and they didn't see that alternative with Ryan Smith. They did see that with Larry Householder.
Republicans, I'm guessing, the ones who voted for him, have some second thoughts now, Mark, that they went with him and not Ryan Smith or another person?
I think that's right. There are a lot of folks in the House were not here during Householder 1.0. And so some of them might have been surprised. Those of us who've been around the State House, are more familiar with what's gone on in the past. I would point to what our Republican Party chairperson, Jane Timken, said the day this came out. One of the things she said in her statement was that when she saw that Larry Householder sought Democrat votes to become Speaker, she knew he would, he did things his own way, and that now he would have to face his own reckoning. And I think that puts it well.
Right now, there is talk of changing, repeal and replace. Where have we heard that before? Repeal and replace House Bill 6. This is a tremendous piece of legislation. From a policy standpoint, it saves 2 nuclear power plants which do not emit any emissions, so they are clean energy as far as emissions are concerned. Of course, the waste sticks around for eons. It saves 4,000 jobs at least up in northern Ohio. It maintains Ohio's diverse energy infrastructure. What are the chances that that bill gets scrapped as a whole, Laura? What is the thinking, or does it just get tweaked? Or is it like the gun legislation that Governor DeWine proposed a year ago after the Dayton shooting, and it just fades away?
That bill has not quite faded away. The gun bill is still pending in the Senate, but its chances of passage are pretty minimal. This House Bill 6 is a really big bell, and it's hard to unring the bell. I think that they could repeal it, but there's going to be a massive fight over how to replace it. So they may not, I don't think they'll act on Part 1 without having Part 2 ready to go. I think that, there is the argument that it saves jobs, nuclear power plant jobs, but there's the counter argument, which we heard from the opponents of House Bill 6, which is that there's all these energy conservation, green energy jobs, renewable energy jobs, like more than 20,000 of those, that we're going to get wiped out by wiping out or weakening the renewable energy standards.
Derrick, I'm guessing the folks who support the clean energy industry are saying, we would like to just re-level the playing field, not have all the subsidies go to coal and nukes, that there should be, if you revised House Bill 6 to offer more subsidies, more help, reinstall the efficiency standards. Is that a possible solution to revisit, as new Speaker Cupp says, House Bill 6?
Yeah, first of all, I do think that the public is going to be closely watching what happens with the repeal of House Bill 6. The public trust has been broken. And so because the public trust has been broken, everyone is going to be paying attention to this repeal bill. I know that there's a bill out there, House Bill 738, that's been introduced by Representatives Odell and Representative Skindle that would repeal House Bill 6. It's going to be very closely watched. Renewable energy is the future of energy in this state. Nuclear power and coal power is regressive. So why would we not want renewable energy in the state of Ohio?
Mark, you're a free market guy. I am. This was a huge interference in the free market by propping up, bailing out 2 plants that employ a lot of people, had a good past, but they would have failed if it were not for government intervention. What should happen with House Bill 6?
Yeah, I'll never run for office, but if I did, I would take the free market view, which is that industry should rise or fall on their own merit, and renewables right now would fall on their own merit, and maybe nuclear would as well. But what we see in the General Assembly of every state, not just Ohio, is we see compromises being made by people who'd like to get to a majority in big policy. It's not a fun process to watch. We all know the old saying about sausages and laws, and there's a reason why that's true, because the deals that get made, the compromises that are struck, and when we look back at them, we look at them and say, how did that happen?
I want to make a point. Derrick said that this repeal and replace effort will get a lot of attention. Everybody will be watching it. But My colleagues and I covered the heck out of House Bill 6 as it went through. We documented everything we could. We made connections between Generation Now and Jeff Longstreth and Growth and Opportunity PAC. We had shined a light on this bill over and over and over again, and it still passed. So, you know.
Yeah, it's passed with $61 million of help. It did pass.
And 3 extra votes.
Is that
in-house.
illustrative of the power that the energy lobby, First Energy?
Yeah, there was like an army of people registered on House Bill 6. I downloaded a spreadsheet, and it was more than 100 people.
It's our tradition to take questions from the audience. So folks who are here in the room, the microphone is there, and then we've also set up a system where folks who are watching us virtually can ask questions as well, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Mark Weaver, who's Bob Cupp? The new House Speaker. The first thing you noticed when he approached the podium to get sworn in is he was wearing a mask, a face mask, something that Larry Householder and his supporters absolutely refused to do. So right away you saw a symbol that this was at least going to be a more moderate person than Larry Householder.
So you're asking me, who was that masked man?
That's right, who was that
masked man was Bob Cupp of Allen County, who I'm proud to have been a consultant to when he was a senator and when he was a Supreme Court justice. And although nobody cares what I think, when I spoke to folks in the first few days of this, I started raising his name. No one was paying me to say it. But what I said to him, what I said to those folks, what I'll say to you is, he is literally and figuratively a Boy Scout. If you know Bob Cupp, you know he is a gentle, kind soul, and he has a great sense of consensus. And more importantly, he understands the legislature. I first met him when I first started doing campaigns in Ohio in 1990. So he understands the history of lawmaking. He came about during the pre-term limit era, where you had to learn the ins and outs of the legislature before you moved up. And again, no one's paying me to say this, but I think it was a brilliant move to take somebody like Bob Cupp and make him speaker.
Laura, he's conservative, though. He had a moderate view on the mask, but he's pretty down the line, you know, anti-abortion, pro-gun rights, more of a pro-business, less government intervention guy.
He fits in really well in the Ohio House. I mean, that's the Republican caucus right there.
Yeah. Do Democrats think, Derrick, that they can work with him?
Well, you know, I'll quote Minority Leader Amelia Sykes. She says that the caucus doesn't trust any of them, right? And I think the safe choice would have been to, you know, have some Democrats to buy into who the new speaker would be. What I found very ironic is that the GOP, you know, voted to oust ex-Speaker Larry Householder, but would not consider taking him out of the House of Representatives. And I know that these are allegations against the ex-Speaker at this point, but if the allegations were tough enough to remove him as Speaker, why aren't they tough enough to take him out of the GOP caucus?
We love to talk about intricacies of legislative rules, but Laura, there's a reason for that from an operational standpoint.
Yeah, so Speaker Cupp said that under the Constitution, somebody can only be expelled once. And Larry Householder is on the ballot unopposed in Perry County. So unless he is convicted of a felony, which, you know, is automatic expulsion, he's very likely to return next legislative session.
So did they promise, Laura, that if he is reelected, that they would expel him next time?
They didn't make that promise, but he just said, basically they have to keep their powder dry. They can't expel him now and then expel him again. You only get one expulsion.
Yeah. And listen, I'm not an elected official, but it seems to me that if I was in a caucus and you had someone that's being charged and alleged of being the mastermind of a $61 million bribery scandal, I would not want that albatross in my caucus. If he gets elected again, the Republicans are going to have to live with him being a part of the caucus until, you know, whatever happens with the investigation.
I see a 30-second television ad being formed with some of that same language. Anyway, it's our tradition at the Columbus Metropolitan Club to welcome questions from our audience, both here in person and online. We ask you to keep your questions brief and avoid political statements. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Hi, I'm Lucia Valencias from Ion, Ohio. What additional safeguards, in your opinion, would you implement in order to prevent this in the future? So let's say someone comes to your law firm or your lobbying firm, et cetera, and they say, hey, I've got all this money, don't worry about where it came from, to do this particular campaign. Like, what things could those people do to kind of avoid being in a mess like this in the future?
Mark?
Well, one of the reasons why we see what's been labeled dark money is because of limits on campaign contributions, right? The old analogy, it's not mine, but it's true, is that money is like water, and if there's water around the base of your house, it will get into the basement no matter what you do. Money will flow in. So when Ohio and also federal, Congress, cap the amount of money that Bill Gates can give to politics or any other wealthy person, someone who has an opinion is going to find ways to get it in. So one thing we could do is to remove that cap. Now, some people would clutch their pearls and say, Mark, that's terrible that a rich person can spend money to affect politics. They will have more political say than I will. That's one downside. The upside is the money would all be reportable, and anybody could sign in and see who gave what, and there'd be more accountability.
One thing that you could do is do public funding of campaigns. I mean, that's one thing that you could do. As I mentioned earlier, because we have the Citizens United Supreme Court case, it makes it very difficult. It would that would have to be overturned by the Supreme Court in order for this dark money to be exposed.
I have a pointer. Read the newspaper. I mean, I think that, honest to God, if people subscribe to your local paper, read the paper, and be informed, there's a better chance that this kind of stuff's not going to happen.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, so I'll go through them quickly, and maybe our answers can be relatively quick, too. Ronald Betts, as the saying goes, power corrupts. What can be done in addition to transparency of dark money to ensure that this type of corruption, which is probably fairly common on a smaller scale, will not happen? Does the state government have inspector generals like the federal government, and if not, could that be instituted now?
State government does have an inspector general. That inspector general only has authority over the executive branch, which is the governor's branch, doesn't impact into the legislature, doesn't impact into the other statewide office holders. There is a legislative inspector general who has a different set of tools available to him than the state inspector general has. So we do have some form of inspector general. And from time to time, we'll see investigations released by our inspector general on different topics.
They generally don't look into campaign financing, though, do they?
No, we have an Ohio Elections Commission, and any citizen can bring a complaint, and that Elections Commission has expertise in that area, and that's one venue where you can take a complaint.
Yes. William Coburn from Bearhaven, is anyone looking into whether Speaker Householder might have corrupted other legislation during his tenure? And if so, could there be recall on other bills?
Laura?
Yes.
Okay.
Some of that,
I'm looking.
yeah.
If you got any tips, call me.
Okay.
Well, Cliff Rosenberger was allegedly involved with payday lending, and there was a lot of money flowing around that issue, the short-term loans, and that's out there. There's ECOT is another. They're all possibilities, I guess. Speculating, but there was smoke there. Derrick, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I'm sure that the FBI is looking at everything right now.
Kathy Ann Kowalski, Energy News Network in Ohio. Should a stronger duty to investigate or other obligations be imposed on the law firms or political consultants to make sure that dark money groups they do work for are not involved in any bribery or corruption? And then the other piece of this question, what changes would the lawyers and political consultants on the panel make to allow the press and public to know who is paying for work they do for a 501c4, PAC, or for-profit, or other organizations involved in political activity that is not otherwise directly disclosed to the Federal Elections Commission?
Derrick, we'll start with you. What responsibility do lobbyists and advocates have?
Well, I can speak for my own firm. You have to self-police. If it doesn't pass the smell test, then you shouldn't be involved in it. You know, as lobbyists and political consultants, we have an obligation to know what the law is and to know what is ethical, what's not ethical, what's lawful, what's not lawful. So I would say that you have to self-police your own firm first and foremost.
Mark?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I avoid unethical activity because it's wrong, but also because I could lose my law license. So I have a double incentive, what my mother taught me growing up and what the bar told me my responsibility was when I became an attorney. Having said that, no regulation, no law, no set of ethical rules substitutes for American voters paying attention to who's running for office, pressing them hard on what they stand for, looking closely at the issues, and going to the ballot box having done your homework. Because too many voters go to the election booth, and it's like showing up to a college test that they didn't study for. And so as a result, they look for the name they know, which didn't help me in 7th grade science, and it doesn't help us now in civics. And so that power, American voters retaking the system and being responsible for it, doesn't solve every problem we're facing, solves a lot of them.
How realistic?
That
go
goes
ahead.
back to my point of read the paper.
That's one of the resources you would use,
Read the
absolutely.
newspaper.
But honestly, how realistic is that? I mean, we're busy people, and we have kids, we've got partners and spouses, we've got jobs, we've got to keep track of our school board, we've got to keep track of our city council, we've got to keep track of our Statehouse and federal. There has to be guardrails, even if the voters did as you ask and paid close attention and voted on that one issue. Yeah, the guy or that woman got her hand caught in the cookie jar, but this person is with me on everything else.
If we have the capacity to maintain our fantasy football statistics, we have the capacity to know who's running for office and what they stand for. When Ben Franklin was famously asked about what sort of government the founders had given us, he famously replied, "A republic if you could keep it." What he meant was, a lot of folks said, just give us a king. Life is so much easier when there's a king. The king tells us what to do. We know where the guidelines are. Very clear. What Franklin meant was, we're going to give you a republic, but it takes participation, and that's hard. And no disrespect to fantasy football leagues, but that's a lot of work to keep track of those stats, and it's got very little role in our life.
There's still rules in fantasy football, though.
I hear you.
All right, go ahead.
Jim Hartman has this question. Any chance the state of Ohio could get control of the nuclear power plants and run them?
I don't know. I vote for Mike Thompson to run the nuclear plants.
No, thanks. Science is not my forte, especially not nuclear science.
Julie Keckstein says, what gives the panel hope?
What David DeVillers did last week gives me hope, right? Now, obviously, I'm a little partial because I've been a prosecutor. I've never worked on the defense side, but prosecutors are part of the system. What we saw was not the system broken. We saw the system working. We saw, when we're watching, I was watching the Blue Jackets last night, right? When the referee blows the whistle, I really believe the referee is trying to enforce the rules. I don't believe they're in the tank for one team or the other. What David DeVillers did gives me hope.
Laura, have you seen, it's only been 2 weeks, but have you, and the lawmakers aren't really in town very much, not very many of them anyway. Have you seen a change in the operation of the State House? Do you anticipate seeing a change in how the State House operates?
Well, now we have a new speaker,
Yep.
and he may be the first guy in Ohio history who didn't hustle and claw his way into the position. He's sort of the accidental speaker. Usually you have to really lay the groundwork to become speaker, raise a lot of money, make a lot of connections, advocate for your people, lobby within the caucus to get the votes, et cetera. And I think, so we see that change. I think there's a lot of unsettled times in the State House right now. I think that a lot of people are wondering what other shoes are going to drop, where's this going to go? You know, if they do repeal House Bill 6, how should they fashion something else? Should they reform campaign finance rules? Should they reform ethics laws? You know, and I think a lot of that will kind of coalesce maybe in lame duck.
Derrick, corruption it's a true bipartisan activity. This is a whopper, but there are other cases around the state of corruption involving Democrats. Cincinnati, Toledo, smells of it here in Columbus from a few years ago. What gives you hope that we can wipe this out?
Well, what gives me hope is that I know that just working in the State House, I know that there are very good state representatives and state senators. There are very good elected officials that are around the state. And actually, you know, I'm going to stand up for the lobbying community too. The vast majority of the lobbying community are good, hardworking people that abide by the rules. And they bring a wealth of information to legislators and elected officials from all around the state. So, you know, that gives me hope knowing that we do have good people that are in office right now that want to do the right things.
One more question, I guess, right, Jen?
Yes. Gary Walzer, why did this happen in Ohio? Are there similar instances of entities using the Citizens United case to affect legislation in other states?
Well, evil has been in the heart of man since the fall, so this is nothing new. With respect to this flavor of wrongdoing, there's some hint that the Speaker of the House of Illinois may be having some problems, Speaker Madigan, whose daughter, by the way, either was or is the Attorney General of Illinois. That's an interesting thing, and there may be some tie-ins. And so I think if you did a look around these different states, you'd see different varieties of bad actors doing bad things. But to echo what Derrick said, you'd also see a lot of good people who are in it for the right reason, who are trying to follow the rules.
Any, Laura or Derrick, any comparable cases like this out there?
Why did it happen in Ohio? First off, it needs to be proven in a court of law. But based on the allegations, it seems that there were willing people to, you know, dance. The briber, the bribee, and there was a lot of money, like a $1.3 billion bailout bill at stake. It's a lot of money.
How much does gerrymandering, Ohio is perhaps one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. Republicans control that right now, Democrats, that's another bipartisan activity. But Republicans are pretty much untouchable except in the primary. Does that, Derrick, lead to this type of activity on both sides, both Democrats who gerrymander and win seats that are not competitive, and Republicans who win seats that are not competitive?
I'm clearly convinced that the Republicans have the supermajority that they do in the House because of gerrymandering. There was a ballot initiative a few years ago to try to get that curbed. I believe that was State Issue 1 that will go in effect, I believe, in 2021, I believe. But, gerrymandering makes the right conditions for one party to have absolute power. And, when you have absolute power and there's no checks and balances, unfortunate things can happen.
Another story that sort of has perhaps gotten a little lost in this is, Laura, you reported that Larry Householder was looking at trying to get rid of term limits, which some people say is good or bad, but just briefly, what was going on there?
So there was an effort to put forth a constitutional amendment on the November ballot to kind of reform. Term limits were approved in, 92 or 94? And it put a 92, and there was an 8-year limit in each chamber. But there's some people that ping pong back and forth. And so this proposal was to stop the ping ponging and put a 16-year limit on how much time you could spend in the legislature in either chamber. But it would have reset the clock for everybody who was already there. So Larry Householder conceivably could have been Speaker until 2038 if that had COVID kind of interrupted because then the petition circulating really kind of circled the drain, and that's where it ended. Yeah,
and the argument is that term limits brings fresh blood into the legislature. The argument against it is that it's too much turnover and the powers behind the reps and the senators have too much power. The day that
Larry Householder took over as Speaker in January 2019, he said that lobbyists and the executive branch have a lot of power in the age of term limits, not the people who are elected to represent.
Okay, now we have time for one more question.
One more question. What impact, if any, do you think this current situation, this current corruption case is going to have on Ohio voters when they go to the election this fall?
Derrick, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think it's going to have a profound effect on how voters vote. Right now, as we speak, there's polls out there that say that the president is trailing or at least tied with former Vice President Biden.
In Ohio.
In Ohio.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Democratic caucus, I think that they're 12 seats away from breaking that supermajority that the Republicans currently hold in the Ohio House of Representatives. You know, anytime you have a public corruption scandal or press around it, you know, it does shine light on the party that's in power. And I think that there will be some political casualties as a result of this.
Mark?
Well, the Trump-Biden race will be resolved by the equities of Trump and Biden, and it will not affect turnout because turnout's going to be high no matter what. The only place it could affect is what Derrick mentioned is in the Ohio House. If some of these vulnerable Republicans are unable to fund their races, there could be a change. I wouldn't say a change of leadership, but there could be a change in the composition.
Part of the problem is, Laura, the candidates are already baked in. We've already had our primary. If someone's going to challenge Larry Householder, they have to be a write-in. But still, some of these competitive ones could be swung by this, right?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of, swing legislative seats that this corruption scandal could influence. Now, is it going to be enough that the Democrats are able to take over the House? That's up for debate.
If you have any money, I would try to get cultureofcorruption.com, see if that's available, because that will be used a lot over the next 3 or 4 months. Thanks very much, Mark. Steve.
I hope you enjoyed today's forum. All this talk about C4, and I think it's just another name for explosives, so maybe we can think that way. Remember, if you like CMC, you can join right now at columbusmetroclub.org and receive 2 months bonus membership. We'll hope you'll tune in next Wednesday at noon online or in person here at the Boathouse as we continue the series Racism, Where Do We Go From Here, as we explore the vote featuring Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose, Executive Director of the Ohio League of Women Voters Jen Miller, and others. Please don't miss this conversation. Thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, PNC, the Columbus Dispatch, and WBNS. And to our online virtual seat patrons, thank you. And a special thanks to our speakers, Mark Weaver, Laura Bischoff, Derrick Clay, and of course, Mike Thompson. We hope to see you again soon, but until then, be well and stay safe.